There we go. People coming in. Hello, everybody. More people coming in. Good to see you there. Tishan, good to see you. Stephanie, very good to see you. Michael Lee, excellent. Andrew, all the way from Abu Dhabi. Hope you're well. Thomas Brown, all the way from San Francisco. Well done for getting up so early. Excellent, excellent. Well done. More people. Stefan from Vienna. Good, good, good. Okay, well, more and more people will be coming in. So, but we like to start on time and we like to stop on time. So today I welcome forum member Dan Sandhu. Many of you obviously know Dan because he's been a very supportive forum member for some time now. And he's very kindly invited Richard Taylor to be in conversation with him today about the future of education and educational opportunities. And we will, as always, move very quickly on. They will talk for 20 minutes in conversation, and please then put your questions in the sidebar and we'll come in for those last 10 minutes to open up the discussion. So Dan, lovely to see you there. There you are in Richmond, looks very nice. I know Richard's in Westminster. I'm in Oxford. For all of those who are outside of the UK, we are having the most beautiful day today. So we hope you feel envious. Dan, good to see you. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Simon. Every day is a beautiful day here, of course, in the UK. That's my sales pitch for UK tourism. Good, great. Well, great to be here. Thanks very much. Yeah, I've been part of the forum for a while. I've been in education technology for a while. And currently I run a maths-based education company in the UK. We've got about 1.8 million students we look after in half of all English secondary schools. We've grown pretty much from a standing start in 3 years when we only had 300 schools, now 30 schools. Now we've got about 1,900. We've got an emerging footprint in about 19 countries. Richard, I've known for many years. Richard is a controversial, I'll say that openly, controversial part of the EdTech community in the UK. If anyone's ever been to an EdTech conference, Richard will be the one that asks the most annoying questions from the back and makes the panelists very, very uncomfortable. He is a wealth of knowledge about education in the UK and internationally. Thanks for joining, Richard. Really a pleasure to have you here.
Well, I'll do my best to try and not meet everyone's expectations as usual.
Great.
It's lovely to be here.
I suppose just kicking off, I mean, the world's gone through tragic circumstances in the last 18 months, and I think we've all been personally touched by it. But then we have point there was 1.2, 1.3 billion kids out. Takeaway for, let's leave it at a government level to start off with. What's the biggest takeaway for the government about what's happening in education?
Well, I think most governments have to realise that EdTech's been around pretty solidly for the last 30 years, and most of them have really failed to make much use of it in substantive ways. And I think the thing that shocked me most was when lockdown started in the UK, the government came up with $6 million to pay for consultants to help schools implement G. Than giving the money to consultants, I would have simply gone out and fired all those head teachers and management teams who had failed to avail themselves of things like this in the last sort of 15 years. I think it's for governments, it's been quite a painful point because it's shown up lots of shortcomings, both structural that aren't just to do with tech, but if you have tech, you've got to use it, and if you use it, how do you use it effectively? And that hasn't been much of a metric yet.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've noticed in the past there were fads and fashions, and there were various. You've seen a lot more than me in terms of fads and fashions. This time there was, I sense, more the first lockdown, a more degree of desperation when schools needed anything, doesn't matter anything, partly to keep the parents off their back, partly to demonstrate they were doing something, without any real good thought about efficacy. And I think the second lockdown in the UK definitely was a sea change difference where, particularly this year, I think 6 months into it, in effect, the teachers took a step back and said, what do we really need? Now, I don't know whether the government's procurement process helped in this or not. There's more devices than money. I mean, there's 1.3 million more devices. That's got to help, hasn't it?
Look, I think it helps, but it's probably not going to help the kids who need it most. The UK government's got 1.3 million low-cost devices, and it bought those maybe in Q4 last year, when there are only 10 million of them manufactured in the whole world. Demand's running at about 50 times supply. We've got a global shortage of chips and all the other things. But simply giving a low-cost device to a child who is struggling is no proxy for actually delivering effective education. And I think the difference between the first and the second lockdown in the UK, the first lockdown, there was a degree of panic. In the second lockdown, one of the things the government did in England was issue a temporary continuity directive, which is a legislative tool that actually forced schools to teach online because they had no actual charter necessarily to do so in the first lockdown. And the fact that that didn't exist and that schools didn't have to have any option to teach online legally for many of them is one of those sort of weird anomalies. And it possibly doesn't exist in other countries, although having lived in San Francisco and paid my property taxes and looked at the way the local school system there ran, during the first dot-com boom many years ago, and I've been following it since, it seems that in the States they've had some sort of very similar problems.
So where now, where do the opportunity, so that's sort of the context of what's happened in the last sort of 18 months. Now, on the presumption that there's going to be a phasing back to some degree of normality this year, particularly in the UK where the school year starts in September, where do the opportunities lie? If you're, and we'll have a mix of people on this call and a mix of people who will be listening to conversation afterwards, from investors to family offices to endowments, etc. Where's the opportunities then? And how do you validate the opportunity in EdTech, which is known for lost monies and lost investments?
I think you've got to, it's not a homogenous market. Probably the biggest bit of the EdTech market and the most successful bit is corporate learning. It's not anything to do with K-12 or schools. If you look at the K-12 market specifically, for me at least, the most interesting part is primarily what happens outside schools, because selling into institutional markets, which are predicated on limited government funding, and often capricious sort of changes and choices that governments make, is less exciting. So I think that there's been an increasing realization there's a lot of great stuff that you can do from home and outside the classroom. And whether the changes in schools will reflect what we're starting to see in the workplace, where lots of people are unlikely to go back full time. In the UK and Australia, companies I talk to are all talking having people 2 days a week at home into the foreseeable future. That changes the model, because primary school in particular is 50% childcare. And if that dynamic changes slightly, I think there's a much bigger opportunity in the outside supplementary market for EdTech. And I think we've seen quite a lot of activity there. Everything from companies like Cluey listing in Australia to what Baiju and other people are doing, although some of what they're doing is pretty crazy. In the schools, I think, particularly if you look at in maths and core products like what Sparx do, I think procurement is fundamentally changing here for the better, largely, in as much as there's more centralized procurement by groups of schools who over here are multi-academy trusts, that it'd be maybe potentially school districts and school groups in the States. And I think that's a good thing, because they're more interested in evidence.
You've gone quiet there, Richard. Is that just Richard, Simon?
Yeah, Richard.
I'll unplug it. Is that any better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you. Yes, that's good.
Sorry, my internet connection for some reason occasionally gets unstable, even though my internet provider is downstairs. I'll just try and plug this back in.
No, so I think the point Richard was making was about where the purchasing has changed. I think going forward, particularly in the UK, there was previously a lot of resistance about the large school groups coming together. Obviously, historically, the local government organisations used to buy it. We've noticed at Sparx, particularly now, Richard, that we can have really bigger conversations with those school groups. Yeah. And they're beginning to have a lot more centralised procurement for large projects, and particularly when they are being looked upon as the kind of controlling umbrella organization to help procure the digital devices, they're also now getting closer to providing curriculum devices, which is not the same in other parts of the country. We've got a pilot running in Australia, which is done on a very different basis.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is the best randomized control trial in education comes out of Australia, and it was done all through lockdown. And it basically said there's a very narrow cohort of kids who've been really impacted. How do we focus on reaching them? And I think some of the reactions, things like the national tutoring program here, which are very big ticket, but have been very poorly implemented, haven't really reached the kids who need it most, and the money has been poorly spent. So, procurement hasn't necessarily improved at that level.
And the other obviously favorite subject that both of us have is about the wonders of AI and how it's going to solve all the ills of the world.
Yeah.
So in education particularly, is that past its fad stage now? Because I see some AI getting there, but not many of it is explainable in old terms. I mean, a lot of it is still very black box. What do you think?
Look, I think the problem is that AI has been around for a while now. Like lots of things in education, it's been oversold and underdelivered, or it's been overpromised and underdelivered, including not just to schools, but also to investors. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of the theory of what AI can do and the reality of what needs to be delivered in the classroom are quite a long way away from each other. And I've looked at this area and I spend a lot of time looking at it. And I think there are two companies we both know in the UK, and one of them is Twinkle. Now, Twinkle looks like the simplest content in the world. Twinkle, as you know, makes 20 million after tax every year, and they have 12 full-time data scientists. And at the other end of the pendulum, there's a company we won't mention who are very heavily into AI, but I'm pretty sure they haven't got 12 full-time data scientists. And they don't have a massive audience all around the world, and they're not making 20 million quid a year. So I think my sense is, having spoken and seen a lot of the AI stuff all around the world, is that there is some very interesting opportunity there, but you've got to be very careful in what which horse you're backing in this race. And the problem with AI, like everything else, is it requires, I think, to be effective, AI needs to be built in at a content stage. You can't really just wrap it over the top of stuff very easily. Now, you may have a slightly different view of this with maths because you can probably do other things. But it does seem to me, you're going to get junk data in, junk data out if you don't really have a very good model and a high level of sophistication at a base level. It doesn't matter how much you sort of sit on the top of it, because it's just going to be putting lipstick on a pig.
Yeah, well, that's very true. We follow the absolute philosophy of it's got to be explainable, no black box. A teacher needs to know how the homework is set or how the classroom is delivered, and the AI acts, the machine learning algorithms act with a fair amount of human intervention to make sure it stays on top of everything and is an enabler. And I know a lot of organizations in education are guilty of, as are investors, and I'm sure there's investors on the call today, of not really doing their homework beforehand and not really understanding that what's required from an education investment. It is not a short-term 3-year flip. It's a long-term investment, and it's that whole adage. If you want to go into education, it makes good business sense to invest in impact and evidence, because that makes a business sustainable, which renews the learners, which means there's long-term revenue. Yet they fail to do this repeatedly.
I think this actually, the whole thing about the due diligence, I think, is a really crucial question for investors, because investors do it differently, and a lot of them just do it badly. EdTech companies are very poor about business intelligence, and EdTech investors are probably even worse at it. Big investors outsource it. And if you look at something, say, like AI, you've got to be able to step back and say, well, what's the pedagogy behind it? It can't be a black box solution. If you're an investor, you've got to be interested enough to try and understand, to be able to participate in the conversation. I did the Harvard introductory computer science course, which I probably flunked terribly, but I learned a lot from. You have to have some real interest and breadth beyond just thinking, I'm going to chuck some money here. And I think it always comes back to a very basic issue of if you're investing in any sector, if you're taking a risk, it's recoverable. If you're taking a gamble, it's not. And I think one of the problems I'm seeing increasingly, particularly with early stage investors and through crowd sites and through other forms, is that there are a lot of investors who are into EdTech very much at the gambling end at the moment. And for them, you know, they're not even looking at the odds and trying to work out what the race is. You need to do decent due diligence. I mean, as you know, I said at the assignment report, which is probably the #1 business intelligence report for education 15 years ago, because I thought there was a gap in the market. And I still use that, the repository of all the 10 or 15,000 stories and the hundreds of issues, because it comes out once a month, on a daily basis in terms of the work that I do. But it's not, I mean, I spend, exactly.
Always at hand, Richard, it's always at hand.
Run much better by Ed Trenham for many years now than I could ever do. I was much more opinionated and he's much more technical. But I think business intelligence is important. I've just republished on my blog today, Taylor's 10, which are my 10 introductory questions for education, people who want to be in it. And I would say 99% of the population, even in EdTech, couldn't answer more than 7 of 10 of them correctly. And that's just my first stage. I then have my secret tests, one of which is the escalator test, where if you don't stand on the left and walk up, if you stand on the right and don't walk up, you're probably never going to get my money. Although I was told that was completely untenable because it's not allowing for disabled applicants, which is something I had to change my model a bit for. So, you know, we've all got our tests, but I just think I've been doing this for 30 years now, so mine are a bit different and often are historically based.
No, I think I've taken a very different perspective with investors over the years, you know, having worked with large private equity. And I have worked with investors who claim to be impact investors, but aren't really. And EdTech, for me, EdTech or education generally, the investment model only works if you have, I mean, ideally family offices or endowments who have a long-term view of life. And that's very, very rare. And we're thankfully have impact family office backing, which means we can take a 10-year view of life. And that's very difficult. That's very difficult for education companies, particularly education technology companies. I mean, you hear the horror stories of EdTech companies that are owned by listed PLCs who want their quarterly movement of results, but you think actually it doesn't quite work that way. You know, some new products take a year to test out, and you can't just be driven by the numbers. And I think that drives particular behaviors in both product development and market access, which could actually be counterproductive to learning. I have to remind people sometimes, this is about learning, and this is about learning. And the fact that you've been to school or to university doesn't qualify you as an investor just as much. Going on a plane doesn't qualify me to invest in airline stock.
But I think it's very true. And I think this comes back to one of the topics you wanted to mention today, which is EdTech a bubble right now? And I think the answer is very much so, but not everywhere. I mean, if you look at Sparx, for example, I think there's only one that's actually been listed, who I think listed at $23 at the start of lockdown and are currently trading at 94 cents. There are 6 more along the way. I think the newest SPAC that's looking at doing something in this area is actually owned by James Murdoch, which will be interesting. And the problem with SPACs is they're an interesting model, but it's something I saw sort of when I worked in the finance industry 30 years ago, 30 or more years ago, about, you know, reverse engineering companies into listed entities. And, you know, so in many ways, it's actually not a particularly new thing. Probably the newest structural thing in EdTech, but in the States, not so much in the UK, are rolling funds, which are these new funds that AngelList will let you set up. I wanted to do an EdTech one. They don't want me to do one simply because I wasn't looking at investing exclusively in America. But if you look at some of the prices and multiples at the moment, I would say, and interesting to hear your view, do you really think it is an EdTech bubble? Because I think we are probably in one.
Question.
Very interesting. I mean, I've seen there's a number of companies on the market at the moment in the UK. The expectations are, in my mind, ridiculous because you know, you're trying to equate EdTech or education businesses to fast-growing software businesses and believing that renewal rates and impact are not important. Well, for me, the valuation is driven by very high renewal rates, and this is not because it's a software business, because in education, if you don't have high renewal rates, it means your product's not very good. and people don't like the technology, and it's actually quite devastating from a valuation point of view to have that lack of renewable revenues. Sorry, I'm very conscious of the time, Simon.
No, not at all, not at all. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. So I wanted to just ask my own question, actually, because EdTech and opportunities, but what about the schools themselves? I mean, do they actually want these solutions? And if they do want the solutions or are thinking about the solutions, who is it? Is it the teachers? Is it the headmaster, the headmistress? Is it the government? I mean, do they want solutions?
I think that's a good point. I think we started off 3 years ago with 400 kids in the southwest of England. Currently, we sit at 1.6 million kids across the UK. It's around making sure the technology is enabling. If it's overwhelming for the teachers, they won't adopt it. If it's undermining for the teachers, they won't adopt it. Teachers have been in this profession a long time. The classroom belongs to the teacher. If you try to force something, they won't adopt it. They could be the biggest restriction of any EdTech in a school propagating is the resistance from the teachers. Now, the heads have a very different perspective. Not only do they want education technology to drive learning, they also may want education technology which allows them to monitor performance. So you have this natural dichotomy of teachers wanting it just to drive learning and make their administration easier, heads wanting it for a slightly different reason. And there's an old thing in EdTech particularly, that the people who buy the education technology rarely use it, and the people who use it rarely pay for it. So from a supplier's perspective, you're trying to balance the need to drive learning with the requirements of the person who's going to use it, which could actually be the teacher as well, with the kind of demand of the person who's actually going to pay for it. And so there is a requirement. It's no longer a nice to have. If the pandemic has shown anyone everywhere around the world, it is no longer a nice to have. It is a core essential requirement. That does not mean you have a bad EdTech. It can do just as much damage.
I think I'd look at it slightly differently. I'd say that a lot of schools want a solution. They want a solution which is a combination of EdTech, content, assessment, professional development, and you can't necessarily get that. You can get it from lots of multiple vendors, but it's much more expensive to implement. And so I think for a lot of schools and districts are prepared to have sort of mid-ranking sort of solutions as long as it's a broader solution and a simpler sale for them. And it's not necessarily true in individual schools, but as we move to sort of broader buying constituencies and sometimes government mediated systems, I mean, I think one of the really tricky problems for schools is they can go onto sites that supposedly give information about what are the best products to buy. And I was looking at one yesterday, and the default search results are sponsored. And if you swap it from sponsored to most recommended, the one that comes up as sponsored didn't come up in the first 40 responses of most recommended. So trying to assist schools and buying groups to make better decisions with the information that's out there is really crucial.
So I put the government in that question because I can see Chris Wilkins is there. Chris, I'm going to drag you into this conversation, but Chris was the former special advisor to the Secretary of State for Education. So it'd be quite interesting to hear what you've got to say, Chris.
Also, Simon, I believe there's a question in from Thomas as well.
Yes, I'm going to read that. It's quite a long one, so I'll read it now. Yeah.
Should I just jump in? Thank you, Simon, and thanks, Dan and Richard. It's really interesting. And as Simon said, I one of my roles in government in the past was special advisor at the Department of Education. And I remember when I got there in 2014, the whole area of EdTech was very much sort of backwater in the department, and so much so that a year later, I found myself. I was asked to write a speech to the Secretary of State to make at the BET conference in January of 2015. And when I went to the department and said, well, can you give me some material, some information? There was just tumbleweed. There was basically nothing really to say. And it was fascinating how it was absent from the debate. And, people would tell you various reasons for why that was. And one is the sense that actually, if the focus at the time was all about equality and closing the gap, and actually EdTech has the potential, or it was seen at that time, to exacerbate that gap a little bit. And you see with the pandemic over the past year, it was interesting how government responded, but there was a sense of it's all very well giving out laptops, but actually if you need to give someone a laptop, they might very well not even have the internet at home, and all you're doing really is an advantage in people who do have all this stuff, etc. So there was that sense of it. There was a real focus on standards and structures around academies and stuff at the time. And so EdTech just wasn't really talked about. And whenever I tried to raise it in the department, it was very difficult to get any traction. And ultimately, I sensed the reason for that was because it was scary in the sense of when you start to talk about it really and explore the possibilities, you get to a point where, well, hold on, why do we need these things called schools at all? Or why do we need the traditional school? Why do we need a traditional classroom? Why do we need a teacher? So Dan, really interesting what you were saying there about the deployment of your capability, working alongside it, being enabling, etc. But I'm sort of interested how you've done that, but also, is that sort of fear right? I mean, in 20 years, do we still have a school that looks like a school now and a classroom that looks like a classroom now? What is the vision for this ultimately? Because I think that was the fear factor that was holding it back at the time.
I think that's really a fascinating observation. I think what we had was a situation that we got the teachers to love what we did because we spent every day with the schools. We spent 8 years of research, and slightly sort of tangentially to what Thomas is asking, we spent 8 years almost in medical prep mode, where we were doing medical level research, double blind, randomized control trials with the teachers involved. So they felt it was there. So when they started teaching about it, it became really prominent. And the second thing we did is we got the best teacher in the UK, Colin Hegarty, and his business to be part of the group. And he was a practitioner. So teachers have this sense of the best teacher in the UK is a practitioner. He's helped develop this product as well. He's with this team as well. So there was a double whammy effect. Now, what's going to happen going forward? We're probably having a new Secretary of State next week, most probably. I think.
Dan, I was going to, if I could jump in, I was going to do a little bit of a historical thing, because when I first got here, I spent 2 years as Deputy Director at the DFES, as it was then, in the Business Development Unit. And so, I worked on things like e-learning credits, where we gave away £400 million of software to schools to try and get them using EdTech back in the early 2000s. And then suddenly we had BBC Jam that was going to put everyone out of business, and that was £250 million down the Swanee. So we've been doing EdTech for a long time, and governments wax and wane in their enthusiasms for it. But we've put a huge amount of money into it. And I think one of the problems, and I can say this having worked in government but not being in it now, is that it was largely carrots, but we've never had a stick. And my example of the government spending millions on trying to get schools in lockdown using G Suite and Microsoft 365, rather than incentivizing them to do it, we should be sacking those management teams who haven't done it already, because we've given away billions in the 20 years I've been in the UK. And I saw 400 million go out the door for e-learning credits. Most of it sat in as DVDs and CDs in lockers. And probably the only successful one that I saw was actually Espresso at the time. Yeah. Who still exist, and they're part of Renaissance Learning and Discovery now. So, okay, but it's a long-term issue, really.
So we're up on the buffers here. So I'm Thomas. Can you come in very quickly with your point, and we'll run over slightly. And Andrew, forgive me, but I'll make sure that your question gets to both Dan and Richard for them to answer that for you. Thomas, good to see you from San Francisco. Welcome.
Thank you. And my question had to do with this premise that here in the United States, the pandemic's created this opportunity in healthcare overlaid with this massive pool of capital. That is to say, the people who pay for it, the insurance companies, but there's an overlay of quality assurance measures that's imposed regulatorily. And there's been tremendous advances in the delivery and the quality of these technologies. And I'm actually speaking to you from the Midwest, where I was looking at some companies that are doing this right now. And so, for example, you can see with patients, these plug and play solutions, very easy to use, and you can get instant feedback either from the patient themselves or an interested party. So the analog could be a parent, for instance, that shows that a medical intervention might not be working or giving you the intended outcome that you want, such integration of social determinants of health and things like this. And I found that just that kind of flagging that, this isn't giving us what we need, driven by dollars and quality mandates, has been a really important determinant. And I don't know if there's a parallel in education.
if I could do something quickly, I think there's an interesting point here that one of my arguments I've made for many years, which has never made me very popular, is that any publicly procured EdTech using any system, whether it's a school district in San Francisco or here in London, should come with open data APIs so that we can actually have a flow of information. It shouldn't be siloed data that gets massaged by the company who tell us how great it is. I think having open data APIs for every aspect of EdTech, which is something we're increasingly seeing in health, would be very good for the system to generate the sorts of inflows of data that we could then use to help make some of these systems and decisions.
I totally agree. I think that's what's missing. People are very wary of sharing information. People are also very wary of benchmarking. We set up something called the EdTech Evidence Group with sort of 10 to 15 EdTech companies who are saying, we will demonstrate efficacy, we'll put our research online, we'll share the outcomes, and make sure it's not a kite mark as such, but it starts getting into the discipline of doing the right thing. And adoption has been good, driven by the pandemic, but we've got a long way to get to that kind of level of sophistication.
I would also say, I think Research Ed, which is a UK thing that happens all around the world about making teachers research literate and making better decisions, has been one of the most important things I've seen in the last 20 years in EdTech, but it doesn't come up on official radar and not many EdTech debates.
There's probably a benchmark with the access to data that you referred to, Richard, that because here in the States, like the privacy of healthcare data is extreme. And yet there are accepted measures by which those data are scrubbed, de-identified effectively and made widely available, which is not quite the open API kind of thing that you're talking about, but it's something reasonably close to it. There's probably some benchmarking opportunities there, I'm guessing.
So I
think also, sorry.
So Richard, forgive me, because I'd like to make sure that everybody's we stick to that 30 minutes as long as we possibly can. But I'm going to make sure that Thomas and Andrew are copied into you post this call so that you can continue that conversation. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, Richard. I hope you'll all join again on Thursday. We have Jamie Metzel talking to us on the biology revolution and will it change everything? And are you ready? So we look very much forward to that. And once again, thanks so much and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Everyone.